been thinking about what happened in Kursk recently. Um, there was an attack that took place. I think the proper term is a counterattack. I think it was described as an offensive by the Ukrainians themselves, but it really wasn't on that scale. It was a significant counterattack. They did throw quite a bit into it, but it was, we're talking about a couple dozen vehicles. It's not. It couldn't be described as an offensive. Um, there's simply no way to describe it as an offensive. But they clearly made a real attempt. They had prepared for this. Interesting, I think they've been preparing for it for a while, and but they didn't do a very good job of keeping their plans confidential. Because apparently, about 2 days before the counterattack, military bloggers in Spain were discussing it. It's going to happen at this time and in this way, and it was just as they said. So I don't know how that got, this information got leaked to them, but it was out there, and clearly the Russians knew that it was going to happen. They were completely prepared for it, and so it was. You have to say that it was just a total resounding failure for the Ukrainians. They attempted to punch, I think it was like northeast, and it's not clear why they were trying to do that, because there really wasn't anything in that direction. There really isn't anything, in that area of Kursk anyway. But I think they managed to occupy part of a hamlet for about a day, and then the Russians drove them back with very significant losses. I mean, there are a lot of videos and photos out there of smoking hulks of armored vehicles. I think just like all of their vehicles were destroyed. They began the attack with, I guess it was a column of armored vehicles and a demining vehicle, and it was under a kind of a bell jar of EW. Which was, it was not very extensive, but it was quite powerful, just in that limited area. The problem is that the Russians, actually somewhere around the start of the Kursk incursion, began using fiber optic drones, which are completely impervious to EW. And so, when they realized what was going on, they quickly switched over to their fiber optic drones and just started taking out these vehicles one after another. So you have to say it was a terrific failure. They made a real effort. I mean, there was the initial attack, and they tried to push in, other forces behind them, but it achieved nothing. They made a very small advance on the first day, and then by within 2 days they were back to where they started, and all they had to show for it were these very severe losses. And to give you an idea of how easy it was for the Russians to deal with this attack, while this was going on, just a few kilometers away, the Russians continued with their own offensive. And just like in the period of this counterattack, they took another 3-4 hamlets, tightening the noose further in the Kursk region. So I think, if anything, it was a huge demonstration of Ukrainian weakness. I mean, it just seems, I think you can see from this that Ukraine really is on, maybe I shouldn't say its last legs, because it just seems like they always have a little something left. But they're clearly much weaker than they used to be. When we saw counterattacks like this maybe a year ago, they would achieve something. They'd be able to hold on to a village, for a week or 2 weeks, and then eventually the Russians would push them back. They just achieved nothing, and the Russians hardly seemed to even notice. Again, the neighboring forces, they didn't have to shift any forces or anything. They continued with their own offensive.
So how damaging do you think this is to the Ukraine military, the regime?
Well, it's just part of of the general disaster that has been the Kursk incursion. The whole thing, it never made military sense. It was, and they have lost a lot in this Kursk pocket, you could call it now, and they just won't give up. That's the thing is, it's not, it really is a sideshow. It has no strategic significance. But they have been pouring their best forces, their best equipment into it. They're constantly reinforcing what they have there, and with more equipment, more their most experienced fighters. So it is, it's just part of this most recent counterattack is part of an ongoing disaster.
Right. I've heard that more equipment and was lost in the Kursk region than all of the 2023 summer offensive. Is that true?
Yeah.
Do you know if that?
Well, that is Putin's claim, and I think it's probably true. I mean, there was actually, I think it was a New York Times story a few months ago that admitted that the Ukrainians were losing armor at double the rate, losing armor in Kursk at double the rate that they were losing it in other places. And, I think that it has to be at least double the rate. And the reason is actually quite obvious. There's nothing very mysterious about that fact. They don't have the fortifications there. Remember, in the Donbass, they spent 10 years building up these fortress cities and these trenches and tunnels and underground bunkers and reinforced high rises that they have a lot of cities or large towns, large villages in Donbass where they can actually hide or assemble forces and prepare for attacks, but they don't have any of that. This is a very sparsely populated area. It's Russian territory. Obviously, the Ukrainians weren't there building up fortifications, so they're just out in the open, and it's actually been just sort of like a gift to the Russians. Yeah, there was that initial embarrassment. There's no question about it, but it's just been they're at a severe disadvantage. The Ukrainians are when they're fighting there. They're losing. They had their most secure fortifications in the Donbass, and some of those are still left. But the Russians have broken through. Let's say like 95 or maybe even more, 95% or maybe even more of those fortifications. Like I've said, they're coming to the very, very end of them. And after that, it becomes a little bit more like Kursk, in eastern Ukraine there.
The level of destruction of the equipment must be massive to be greater than that 2023 summer offensive, because that summer offensive was touted, and they're not hiding behind. It's an offensive. They weren't hiding behind those fortifications, like we said.
Yeah.
We saw them rolling over minefields, getting bogged down, and just getting blown up.
Yeah.
And from what we've seen with Kursk almost seems like a sideshow in comparison to the 2023 offensive. But then you hear that actually more armor, more equipment was destroyed in Kursk, but we don't talk about it that much. It's not really.
Right. Well, if you follow the Telegram channels, you'll see every day there's something. There's always some little video. I usually don't waste my time watching it, but there's some video about a tank or a column of armored vehicles being wiped out in the Kursk area. Not just in Kursk, but just Sumy, where the launching area, the rear for Kursk. So the Russians have been striking both into Sumy and into Kursk, and it's just a daily thing. Again, it doesn't get all that much attention, but the numbers keep on increasing. The wreckage keeps on piling up.
You said that this demonstrated Ukraine's weakness. Does Ukraine's weakness equate to NATO's weakness? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, you have to say it. I mean, it's okay. It is NATO equipment now. I mean, all of this equipment that's being destroyed is NATO equipment. So that does show something. I think that, clearly NATO just doesn't have the equipment, the munitions to give Ukraine that it did back in 2023. That was sort of the last hurrah. That's when there was all this, kind of this. It was all spoken of with, great anticipation, great excitement. We're giving them, hey, now it's going to be Leopards and Challengers, the best that NATO has to offer. This is just they're going to break through those Russian lines and march to Azov, and soon they're going to be in Crimea. And there was all that talk. They were giving him a lot of equipment, an awful lot of equipment, and well, we know what happened then. That offensive was thoroughly defeated. But they don't even have that equipment now. They don't have nearly as much.
Right. The Leopard 2 tank, the Abrams tank, these were legendary tanks. I mean, I remember them, and just think like these are the baddest things out there. But then you see videos of them getting blown up by a $10,000 drone. So this has to be causing shockwaves through the military-industrial complex in terms of their ability to sell arms. If you're part of NATO, you're required to buy NATO equipment, overpriced, ineffective products. But the rest of the world, do you think that what kind of repercussions would this have on the MIC if all of a sudden when they go to the arms expos, people just say, yeah, I don't want those anymore. I've seen how they've been working in Kursk.
Yeah. No, it's a huge, actually, you're right. I mean, this is a huge issue because we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. This is a huge industry, a very, very important industry for the U.S. As the U.S. has been, its industrial base has shrunk over the past few decades. We've gone from, we used to be a leader in many areas of industry, and now it's, maybe the one area of industry where we're still definitely a leader of some sorts, at least, when you look at the total price tags, is military equipment. So this is a huge issue. This is a matter, it's almost an existential issue for the U.S. and certainly for the MIC. And I think that probably explains a lot of the very tight narrative control. It's not just that the prestige of the U.S. is at stake, but a lot of the bottom line for a lot of businesses, for leading corporations in the United States, that too is at stake. And so again, I noticed that there's one reason maybe why we're not seeing the news on destroyed armored vehicles and tanks and so forth in the Kursk region. I think there's probably a deliberate effort to suppress that kind of news.
You said it's existential potentially. So what do you think could be the fallout exactly if
maybe it's definitely existential for MIC. I might be overstating it a bit when you're talking about the U.S., but it's highly significant. It's more than highly significant. We're talking about probably the leading industry, and if it takes a severe blow, that is going to do serious damage to the U.S. economy.
Then will it? In my mind, it would just sort of affect just few people that are really lining their pockets. Would it really affect the everyday American economy, or could this be a good thing for if the MIC is exposed?
I mean, if it was, of course, the people that make the most money off of it are the CEOs and the lobbyists and so forth, the Congress critters, but U.S. workers would be affected too. There's no question about it. There's actually a deliberate effort. There has long been a deliberate effort by the Pentagon to distribute their largesse throughout the U.S. I think every state in the U.S. I can't remember. There's certain large systems. It might have been the F-35 or it may have been something else, in which it turned out that there were actually contracts in every one of the 50 states. And that was no accident. Essentially they were buying the support of congressmen around the country. And they do that by, as something that the local member of Congress can go to his people and say, thanks to my efforts, we're going to have this new factory here, or our factory is going to get these new orders, and we're going to add 100 workers, or the numbers are probably not that great, but they do mean something.
Do you think if we see less purchases or less sales of arms to countries like Saudi Arabia throughout the global south, that the way that the military industrial complex would to compensate that was just to build the U.S. government even more. So that way the same amount of money goes through and nothing really changes. You know what I mean? That almost feels like the game.
Yeah. Well, okay. Yeah. I mean, there are sales that are competitive, and those are like sales or semi-competitive. Let's say to sales to Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia does have a choice. I think Saudi Arabia is always, at least for the foreseeable future, is going to buy a fair amount from the U.S. because though it has moved away from the U.S., it still wants to kind of keep one foot in the U.S. camp. And so just for that reason, for political reasons, I think they're going to continue to buy arms from the U.S. But they do have options. And they've already started to exercise, that option. Like recently they bought, it was an air defense system from Russia, which they had never done before. And I think that's going to be part of a trend. So, some countries like Saudi Arabia are going to just kind of maybe split things and maybe get half their arms from the U.S., but the other half from Russia and maybe China or other countries. But some countries are just going to switch completely to, at least there's the potential for that. They're just going to say, hey, this is too expensive and it doesn't work. We're going to start buying from the Russians.
Right. Just a whole nother unraveling thread you can pull. You mentioned as well that this was leaked, the Kursk offensive was leaked 2 days before military bloggers. So first of all, if it was leaked and people were writing about it, it was clear that the Russians knew. Why did you think they went ahead and did it anyways?
I don't know.
If it was leaked? And are these leaks, are they becoming more and more prevalent?
I've only heard about it in this case. Like the Kursk incursion itself was a real surprise. I know there's this theory that the Russians might have known about it and laid a trap. I don't believe that for a number of reasons. It's not impossible, but I think they were taken by surprise. And so they had done, really quite a good job of keeping their preparation secret. I think one of the reasons that they succeeded with Kursk is that there had been a lot of talk that the Russians were maybe planning some kind of incursion in the area. And so, if a buildup of forces could have been defensive, and maybe that's how the Russians, interpreted it. But, that's one thing. Yeah, I can't explain why security was so bad in this most recent case. And I don't know if it's part of a trend or not. It may be that there's just kind of maybe growing dissent within the Ukrainian military. They're really frustrated with what's going on. And, they're starting to talk and complain.
Right. Yeah, something you mentioned was the use of fiber optic drones.
Right.
I saw this as well in how they can completely evade any EW system because it has a direct link. And another advantage of these fiber optic drones, if you watch them, is that they have a very, very high frame rate. So the picture quality is very good.
Yeah.
It's not like with the other one. So it's like playing a flight simulator game. It's very, very accurate. But I'm wondering, why is it that we haven't seen the Ukrainians develop something similar? Because they've been using these fiber optic drones for a while. I don't think the technology is that advanced, but we haven't seen the Ukrainians try to counter it with something like that.
Yeah.
To use their own,
Yeah, I think we will see it. This is this conflict has seen both sides kind of go through multiple generations of drone technology. Drone technology has been evolving, rapidly throughout this conflict. And at the start, Ukraine was actually clearly in the lead. It was an area in which the Russians underinvested. And they really had very few drones to speak of, but then quickly discovered that, okay, this is the new weapon. This is a weapon that we must have in this 21st century conflict. And so they began to catch up, and now I think everyone acknowledges that the Russians have moved ahead. But the Ukrainians, that's one area where they've shown themselves to be quite resourceful. It's actually one area where they're not completely dependent on, NATO. They have a lot of small workshops distributed throughout the country. So it's difficult for the Russians to stop production of these drones. And, they've shown themselves to be innovative. Again, they're falling behind the Russians, but I think it's inevitable that we'll see fiber optic drones on the Ukrainian side. I know that they're working on AI drones with the help of, I believe, Google, some major U.S. corporations. And those too can evade EW because they're not dependent on a signal from the ground. But my understanding is that the AI drones, the AI capability just kind of is activated in the final stage, in the terminal portion of the flight. And so for the first part of the flight, you still need a human operator and you need a signal link to a ground base. And for the first part of the flight, it is vulnerable to EW. It's just at the very end when a target has been found that it can actually hone in on it, and it doesn't have to. It can do it, without any sort of signal link, and is therefore impervious to EW, or maybe, at least to EW as it is currently exists. Apparently, there are ways to counter this, though, because it's dependent on a visual image right at the end. That's what it's using to target. So one possible solution is to actually use a strobe light, to direct a strobe light at the drone, the AI drone, as it's approaching, and that confuses it. It prevents it from seeing the image, and it goes off course. So there are things, it's going to be this constant back and forth. One side develops a new technology, and the other side develops the technology to counter it, and that's what we've seen throughout this conflict. And I think that's something that we're going to continue to see.
War's getting scary, Dad. AI drones. See, This is the future. AI drones, hypersonic missiles, and the U.S. and NATO seem to be stuck in tanks and aircraft carriers.
Right.
And,
well, apparently tanks still have a place. I kind of have my doubts about it, but the Russians are still churning out a lot of tanks, and I think what they're doing. Well, I know this is what they're doing. They're trying to. They're modifying the tanks so that they can continue to function in this new battlefield. So you see they have those cope cages, right? That's something that, like a netting above the tank. That's, again, is to prevent to protect the tank from a drone that's striking from above.
Explode outside of the tank.
Right. And then also, I think they're equipping these tanks with EW units. So when a drone is spotted in the area, it directs a beam at the approaching drone. And then I think I also read somewhere, I'm not quite sure, but they're also maybe kind of reconfiguring the armor, because in the past, the concern was actually with maybe a shell that was being fired from another tank that was that had a horizontal, a path that was parallel to the ground, that was horizontal. But now these drones come down from the top, and there is sort of a weak spot on the top of the tank, and I think they're making some efforts to address that weakness. So, yeah, it seems to me like when you see these videos again and again of, again, like you say, a $10,000 drone destroying a $1 million tank or a multi-million-dollar tank, and you kind of wonder, does this really make sense? I have my doubts about it, but others argue, like people like Big Surge, who's a very astute military analyst. He says, no, the tanks are here to stay. We'll see.
I think one of the most damning things for the future of the U.S. MIC is this war has shown how the inability for the MIC to make adjustments and evolve in this war. We haven't been able. First of all, we can't scale up munition production, but also it seems like we're kind of stuck in just creating the same product over and over again, even though it doesn't work. We haven't seen really much of evolution in terms of NATO equipment. You just said yourself that the drone technology is really largely independent of the Ukrainians are being innovative on their own out of necessity. But the equipment that they're getting from NATO just doesn't seem to work, and NATO doesn't seem to be evolving it. I've seen these armored columns, but I haven't seen like something simple like the netting over the tanks. I haven't
Yeah.
seen that on the NATO
Yeah.
side. Why?
Right.
This isn't
I think
advanced stuff.
yeah, I saw a photo recently, so I think there's just beginning to kind of trickle in. But yeah, I mean, they should be. I agree. I mean, it just seems like there's a lack of awareness. There should be growing alarm, but it's just something that, again, I think there's just this insufferable smugness on the Western side. The sense of superiority. And then, as we've said many times, we have this system that really isn't geared towards winning wars against a peer adversary. It's geared towards lining the pockets of a lot of well-connected people in the West. And again, they're so comfortable with that system that I don't see it changing in any significant way for quite a while. I mean, it should be changing now, but I think the crisis isn't big enough for any real changes.